It's not particularly secretive that I don't love Flutter. It's just not the solution that I personally reach for. I've actually been so harsh towards it that I made a commitment to never talk about it again. And I'm kind of breaking that today, but also not, because most of our focus is going to be on a fork of Flutter that I actually think is a really good idea. I am super hyped about the effort going on here, and even if Flutter isn't the tech that I personally choose and recommend, whenever I see people in the community trying to push the technology and the teams that build it forward, I get excited, and I want to offer my support where I can. I've been super impressed with Matt Carroll and everyone else involved with this effort, and I want to do my best job trying to cover what's going on here, even though I'm not the Flutter guy. So no, going in, I'm probably not the best person to talk about this, but I do have a bunch of the members of the Flutter community here with me. I've went out of my way to research what's going on here and talk to those leading this effort in my best attempts to cover what we're doing here. Speaking of covering what I'm doing here, I gotta pay my team somehow, so let's hear from today's sponsor really quick. Today's sponsor is me, because I couldn't get a sponsor in time for this video. Turns out doing 2+ videos a day is hard to fill with sponsor slots. So if you're a company, a brand, or know a company or brand that might be a good fit for the channel, hit me up at youtube@t3.gg. We're forking Flutter. This is why. Oh boy. I mentioned earlier, I've been super impressed with Matt. I admittedly hadn't heard of him before this. Funny enough, there is actually a Matt Carroll in the React world. He's the DevRel that does a lot of the comms for the React team. So I was surprised that there's now a Matt Carroll in Flutter that is similarly important to pushing the ecosystem. I did a space with him earlier. We'll probably cite some moments from that later. I've just been really impressed with him, both how he thinks about the state of Flutter and how to keep improving the ecosystem, but also how well he communicates. He's one of the best speakers and more thoughtful people I've listened to in a while. So I'm actually really excited to read through this with you guys and do my best to share why this is happening. We're forking Flutter. This is why. Over the years, Flutter has attracted millions of developers who built user interfaces across every platform. Flutter began as a UI toolkit for mobile, iOS and Android only. Then Flutter added support for web. Finally, Flutter expanded to Mac, Windows, and Linux. Across this massive expansion of scope and responsibility, the Flutter team has only marginally increased in size. To help expand Flutter's available labor and accelerate development, we're creating a fork of Flutter called Flock. Flutter's labor shortage. I do have a bit of info here. I've heard that in the Google layoffs, by the way, apparently more are happening right now. Within that chaos, the Flutter team has been hit somewhat hard. There aren't as many people working on Flutter, and they're generally less motivated because the amount of funding going in that direction is not known long term. And there's nothing worse than seeing half your teammates get axed and not knowing if you're just going to get the same treatment in a few months. It destroys morale entirely. And I've seen this happen at plenty of companies, even ones I've worked at like Twitch. So I'm not personally that surprised that the layoffs have both hit Flutter in terms of the actual eng effort they can do, but more importantly, the motivation of whoever is left to keep pushing this thing really hard. Let's do some back of the napkin math to appreciate the Flutter team's labor shortage. How many Flutter devs exist in the world today? My guess is that it's on the order of 1 million devs. Probably. How many are shipping to production is up for debate, but this number wouldn't surprise me. 1 million is reasonably conservative. Cool. We'll go with it. How large is the Flutter team today? Google doesn't publish this info, but my guess is that the team is about 50 people strong. That's 50 people serving the needs of over 1 million. Doing a little bit of division, that means that every single member of the Flutter team is responsible for the needs of 20,000 Flutter devs. The ratio is clearly unworkable for any semblance of customer support. There is things to consider here as well, like React has way more than 1 million people using it, and the core React team is smaller than 50 devs. Like the people who work on React for the web, it's not 50 people and the number is much bigger, but the surface area of what they have to support is much smaller too. And that's where I think the piece above here, where they support all these other platforms, that's key. That is a huge difference. With something like React Native, it was also only iOS and Android originally. Then they kind of added web support through Twitter, actually, believe it or not, building React Native for web. Even though they don't use React Native for iOS or Android, they built it for web with the explicit goal of standardizing how we build on the web at Twitter, which was interesting. And that became what we now have as React Native for web. And then Mac and Windows support was by, of all people, Microsoft. So within React Native, there is still a pretty large team of people who are working on React Native at Meta. It's a lot bigger than those 50 people. But when you consider the fact that React Native for web isn't just maintained by them, it wasn't even built by them, it was built by Twitter, and also the fact that Mac and Windows support is built and maintained by Microsoft, you'll see that the number of people that work on React at Meta isn't necessarily a good measure for these things. That said, the Flutter world is very different, and if this person If Matt is deep enough in the Flutter world that he feels this ratio is worth calling out, it almost certainly is, especially in the context of that team is in charge of managing all of these different platforms. And a lot of the examples I was hearing are around semi-niche use cases for things like Flutter and web that are very worth digging into, and I'm sure we will get there. A labor shortage can always be fixed through hiring. Kind of. I won't harp on that point too much. Due to the company-wide issues at Google, the Flutter team's headcount was frozen in 2023. Then, earlier in 2024, we learned that a small number of layoffs was occurring. It seems that the team may now be expanding again through outsourcing, but we're not likely to see the Flutter team double or quadruple its size anytime soon. To make matters worse, Google's corporate refocus on AI caused the Flutter team to deprioritize whole desktop platforms. As we speak, the Flutter team is in maintenance mode for 3 of its 6 supported platforms. Desktop is quite possibly the greatest untapped value of Flutter, but it's mostly now stagnant. This is also a very interesting point. I'm regularly surprised at how rough multi-platform desktop software is. Electron didn't win because it's incredible. Electron didn't win because it's a great way to build an awesome piece of software. Electron won because it's good enough and it supports everything relatively well. And nothing's gotten close to competing. I actually have Tori as a banned word in my chat because it's not there. And building yet another web layer is not the solution to the problem. Qt is still the closest to like a native solution that we have for true multiplat. React Native is getting there, but they have no focus on Linux whatsoever. Flutter had a real opportunity here. And an interesting thing I heard about when I was chatting with these guys earlier is that there's a lot of effort going into Flutter for desktop from, of all people, Canonical, the people who make Ubuntu. And they're currently working on multi-window support for Flutter, so a Flutter app can have multiple windows open. And in doing such, they're actually focusing initially on Windows because it's the platform that seems both the easiest to implement it in, from my understanding, and the one that has the largest potential impact. But their long-term goal is to get this working in Linux so that it can be easier for them and other devs to build apps that work well on Linux and Windows and Mac all at once. I will also say that the desktop side being owned by Google feels a little bit misaligned because Google's reason for building Chrome was to get out of building desktop software entirely. Google maintained a lot of it. Back when I was in my teens, I had Google Earth installed. I had Google Photos installed. I had Google Play Music Manager installed. I had all these different desktop softwares to manage my Google stuff. And they hated doing that. And they kept expanding and extending Chrome to make it so it was capable of more and more and pushing the web as far as they could so they wouldn't have to maintain this desktop software. Google wants to be a web company. They're as invested as you can be in making the web great. That's why Chrome exists and why they give it out for free and honestly don't use it that terribly. I know I get a lot of crap for saying that Google's investment in Chrome is somewhat noble because their goal is to make the web better, not to make Google better. Their bet is that by making the web better, Google is better positioned to make great software. As such, they don't care about desktop software. So them being the ones who own and make decisions around Flutter for desktop feels very misaligned to me. The cost of limited labor. Limited labor comes at a great cost for a toolkit that has rapidly expanded its user base along with its overall scope. With so few devs to work on tickets, many tickets linger in the backlog. There's actually a point where Flutter had the most open issues of any repo on GitHub, believe it or not. Oh shit, Matt's here. Thank you for stopping by. If you catch anything I'm saying that's not a reasonable take or aligned, let me know. Probably more of a team decision than a corporate decision. The structure of the engine makes it difficult to separate platform support across different projects. That is really good context, actually, to go back to this desktop alignment bit. React Native's architecture makes it, I don't want to say trivial, but relatively easy to handle the many different cases that exist for desktop. Like React's architecture is very separated from the render layer, so it's relatively easy to bind React Native or React itself to different things. That's why we have stuff like React 3 Fiber, which is a way to render React components that turn into Canvas 3D elements. That's why React Native Skia exists, which uses the original Flutter rendering engine, Skia, in order to have really fluid and fancy animations and graphics in your React Native code. React's architecture makes that easy, and I hadn't even thought to comment on that fact, that the way that the Flutter engine behaves makes it more difficult to separate the platforms in terms of building and maintaining them. Very fair point. Thank you for calling that one out. Limited labor comes at a great cost for a toolkit that has rapidly expanded its user base, along with its overall scope. With so few devs to work on tickets, many tickets linger in the backlog. They can easily linger for years if they're ever addressed at all. By the time a member of the Flutter team begins to investigate a ticket, the ticket might be years old. At that point, the Flutter team developer typically asks for further information from the person who filed the ticket. In my experience, when this happens to me, I've long since stopped working with the client who had the initial issue. I've written hundreds of thousands of lines of code since then. I often don't even remember filing the issue, let alone the obscure details related to the original issue. The team can't fix the bug without information from me, and it's been too long for me to provide the information to the team. So the bug gets buried for a future developer to rediscover. Whew. This is so painful and so real. Ugh. Yeah. I've heard this from a lot of open source maintainers that one of the best things you can do if you want to contribute to open source, it isn't writing pull requests, it's helping keep the issues up to date. So if you see an issue that is possibly fixed, possibly not, that's still sitting there open, the best thing in the world you can do for a maintainer is validate that the issue still exists and leave a comment saying, hey, I just tested this, it's still a thing in this version. Or if you can, a sandbox that replicates it so they can see it directly there. Magical. We already have a bunch of open source people saying, yes, please do this, including Lewis, the creator of the language Gleam. Yeah, open source people really want help knowing which issues are still relevant, especially when you have tens of thousands of them. So if you run into an issue, you find it on GitHub, it's 2 years old, and hasn't gotten a meaningful update. If you leave a little comment saying, hey, I'm on the latest version, and this is still a thing that I'm dealing with, that is a really helpful thing to do. Highly recommend. It's a funny joke, but I don't know who's going to be watching this video. There might be more noobs than usual. Totally fine. Do not leave a comment, is this still being maintained? No, please do not do that. Timing isn't just an issue for eventually root causing and fixing bugs. It's also a major product problem. Imagine that you're the engineer director or CTO of a company whose next release is blocked by some Flutter bug. What do you do if the team won't work on that bug for 2 years? Well, if it's a serious bug for your company, then you stop using Flutter. You don't have a choice. You need to keep moving forward. Your team doesn't know how to work on the Flutter framework, and the Flutter framework team is either unresponsive or at least completely non-committal towards a fix. Oh well. Can't use Flutter anymore. Flutter won't survive if these kind of experiences become common. I really like this call out. One of the things that Matt did really well in that Twitter space earlier was describe the reality of a Flutter dev running into problems. Your options are work around the problem, which often isn't viable, fix the problem, which won't get merged, and now you built your own fork, or give up and move off of Flutter entirely. And that's a really crappy place to be in as a Flutter user, fan, community member, even contributor. This is the reason I wanted to cover this all, because it's so important both to recognize when these rock and hard place moments happen, but also to support those fighting to change it. Yeah, Luke Spaghetti talks about these things all the time. If you guys don't know already, Luke's a good friend of mine. He's the one who has been historically my rep from the Flutter community. Him and I did a showdown a while back where I built an app in Flutter, he built it in React Native to see what the experiences were like and to do a contest comparing the two. Love Luke. He's one of those people that pushes really hard in the Flutter community to take advantage of the cool things happening elsewhere and improve the ecosystem as a whole. It's awesome seeing more people like that, like Matt here and his crew, that care enough to push. The Flutter community can help with labor. Flutter has two very valuable qualities. First, it's open source, so any developer can see how any part of Flutter is implemented, and they can even change it. Second, the Flutter framework is written in the same language as Flutter apps. Because of these two qualities, experienced Flutter app devs, as well as package developers, contribute to the Flutter framework. How many Flutter devs exist in the world today who are capable of contributing at a productive level to the Flutter framework? Conservatively, I'd guess that there are at least 1,000 of them. In other words, there are at least 1,000 Flutter devs in the world who could conceivably be hired to the Flutter team if the team wanted to hire that many developers. Remember that ratio of one Flutter team member per 20,000 devs? Every capable Flutter framework contributor in the world regularly contributed to Flutter. The ratio of 1 to 20,000 would drop to 1 in 1,000. Still a big ratio, but way better than what it is now. Moreover, as more external contributors get comfortable submitting fixes and features to Flutter, they'll tend to help train each other to do the same. Thus, the support ratio will continue to move in a better direction. I still don't love the ratio, but what I do like is comparing the difference here. If more people were contributing, the gap here is massive, and that is absolutely worth calling out. If more people were comfortable answering issues, giving useful context, filing PRs to fix it, proving those PRs, and making these decisions, something really good could happen here. But it's not just an issue of how many people there are on the team. It's also the architecture of the team and how prepared they are to accept things from externals. It'd be possible for a 5-person Flutter team to do this much better if that 5-person team was much more collaborative and worked harder to get external contributions in and merged well. And it'd be possible that a 5,000-person team would be worse because they were focused on things the community wasn't aligned with. I think alignment of the team, its structure and culture with the external community and their needs is more important than the ratio here. But the reason is because once that is better aligned, you get an effective, better ratio and you have more people who can meaningfully contribute changes. Why not work directly with the Flutter team? This is a part that I'm excited to read more about. I don't have the full context here beyond what I've heard from that space and chatting with others, but I trust them a lot more than my own judgment here. If increased external contributors is the path to a better Flutter world, then why would we fork Flutter when everyone could just work directly with the Flutter team? It's a tempting proposition to set up a concerted effort to contribute directly to Flutter. After all, the Flutter team regularly touts the number of external contributors that it rolls into each release. According to the Flutter public relations effort, they'd love all those external contributions. But sadly, trying to work with the Flutter team delivers a different reality. While some devs have had success working with the Flutter team, many other devs have found it frustrating, if not unworkable. There are, no doubt, a number of factors that contribute to this result. Different devs will experience different issues, but here are some of them. Limited review labor. This is a big one. Again, with like the culture and structure of the team, when you're building a big open source thing like this and your goal is community maintenance, you should be spending arguably even a majority of your time doing code reviews. A thing I used to do, and I would push on the teams that I worked on with or hired, was the idea that your day should start and end with code review. So the first time you open your laptop, once you start actually working, start in GitHub, go through all of the things you need to review them. Then go do your normal work throughout the day. And before you sign off, try to stop a little early so you can open up GitHub again and just read and review more PRs. It sucks. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that reviewing code is as fun and rewarding as writing it. But we're not paid to have fun. We're paid to make software that works. Reading code reviews, offering feedback, and getting things merged is some of the most value you can bring. And if you want to level up at your job or be more involved in a community, one of the best things you can do is do more and more insightful code reviews. It is huge. Super, super helpful. As Lewis from Gleam said, they spend the majority of their day doing PR reviews and issue triaging. It's kind of nuts. Somebody said that I'm acting like there's a ton of PRs open on anything closed source. Yeah, there are. There were points where there were like 500 plus PRs open on the Twitch code base for the website. That happens a lot, like a lot. I had review queues where I owed reviews to like 30 PRs at a time before. That absolutely happens. Like, there are probably closed source repos that have more PRs open than the biggest open source repos. The biggest code base in the world is not an open source code base. It's a closed one, almost certainly. Enough about that. More of the issues with the experience trying to get changes merged into Flutter. Everything takes forever, and it always seems to be about non-critical details. This kills me. When nits or higher level conversations you're not part of block things. Like an example I ran into was, we're not sure we're ready to adopt this pattern yet. So you can't upgrade that library that relies on the old pattern, even though you updated our code to use the new pattern. Ugh. I hate those things so much. And knowing that you did everything right to solve not just your problem, but any additional problems it might have caused. And the response is, we're not sure we want that yet. Or we want the syntax to be slightly different. And then you have to wait another 3 weeks to 4 months to get another review. And you have to wait even longer for that to come out in a release. Horrifying. Another good call out here is the communication monoculture. Most of the team seems to expect a certain way of communicating, which doesn't match the variety of personalities in the world. Thus, some people have an exceptionally difficult time navigating otherwise quick and simple conversations. I have heard that like the Google way of doing things and talking especially is weird and hard to parse externally. I will say from my experience, again, primarily in the JavaScript and especially the React space, we're generally more open to different types of things, possibly to a fault, where my heated leaning asshole way of doing things is for the most part accepted. It's frowned upon, but when I call something out and say it's really fucking important, the right people will ignore the fact that I said fucking and focus on the important part, which is nice. And that's not the case everywhere. I would like to add one bullet point here. And again, Flutter folks, correct me if this is an unfair thing to add. I don't know what the release cadence looks like for Flutter. My gut feel is that after something gets merged, you don't have any guarantee of when you'll actually be able to ship that in your Flutter app because the release cycle is not a determined thing. Oh, every 3 months a new release happens. But imagine that one of those releases just happened. You finally get your change merged, and now you have to wait 3 months before you can actually use the thing that merged. Terrifying. I don't know how common it is to use whatever's on the master or main branch instead, but apparently package fixes can't land until the release after the engine change lands, so it's often 6 months for some fixes. That's insane. That sucks. So even if you do everything right and you get it contributed to Flutter, it could take 6+ months to get merged. Yeah. And the funny thing with the React 19 thing is the canary is ready to go. They discovered with React 19 that there is one edge case that they changed how suspense works in that results in certain types of applications using suspense in a certain way having much worse performance. And rather than release it broken like that, they're leaving the canary for everybody who needs it. It's an RC. You can go ship that. And a lot of people are shipping it in prod. I know I am. I know Vercel is. I know a lot of other businesses are. But if you need to have those suspense behaviors in things like a pile of suspense queries or inside of React 3 Fiber, you can use React 18 until they finally fix this with 19. But they're not letting the whole ecosystem be held back. And they were actually going to ship it real quick. But then this happened, and now they're waiting. Anyways. Also a good call out from Eli here that Next has a canary release almost every day. So if you do get something merged into the Next code base, you have a canary really soon. And you probably have a major release, or not a major release where it's like a new major version, but a dot update or a minor or a patch that includes your fixes. Happens a lot. My changes the most have been docs changes, to be fair, but these happen a decent bit. Okay, Flutter does have a master release you can always get, which is the latest version, but the framework is really large, and that can be hard because you also have to pull down breaking API changes that might not work with your packages. Whew. Yeah. Back to the articles. This is really good. Whatever your experience is with contributions to Flutter, one has to critically assess why a team that loves external contributions has only managed to merge contributions from 1,500 developers over the span of nearly a decade. My humble suggestion is that it's because the inviting message of the PR team doesn't match the experience of actually pushing a change through the team's policies, developer availability, and technical culture. The only people who can change this reality are the people within the Flutter org. However, most of these people don't actually think any of this is a problem. I know because a number of them have expressed this to me directly. This breaks my heart. This is why I cover these things. When there are people like Matt and like Luke and like all the wonderful Flutter folks I was talking to earlier today, and I see them trying to make this framework great, trying to solve these problems, and trying to make something awesome, both for other devs using Flutter and for the users using the apps they build, to be told by the team making Flutter that their concerns aren't real and these aren't problems that matter, it's the most heartbreaking thing in the world. And I don't want to go down the technical decisions I don't like about Flutter at all. I want to harp on this point. If the people who are aligned with you technically and who are aligned with your goals are coming to you and saying that you are not serving their needs well, you have to take the moment to reflect. This is something I had a really harsh run-in with earlier this year. I was taking sponsor deals that I felt were a better and fairer way to run my channel. I would only take sponsorships from companies that I personally was shipping in production. Because of that, no one could pay me to say something I didn't actually believe. It was all things that I actually liked and felt good recommending. I got shit from people who really liked me and my goals and were aligned even with the brands that I was covering, saying that it felt like they couldn't trust what I was saying because the lines were blurry between what was paid for and what I actually believed. And as hard as that was for me to accept, I sat down, I thought about it, I talked with people, I reflected on the situation, and I made changes I didn't want to make because the people who were aligned with me told me it didn't work and it didn't feel good. And even if they didn't understand how to fix the problem, they could clearly communicate that there was one. And it isn't my place to say, no, there isn't a problem. It's my place to be a little bummed about it, vent about it, and then find a way to fucking fix it. And when there are people like this that are so clearly and concisely expressing the problem, it sucks that they're not being heard. And I will be very loud about this on their behalf because for Flutter to be great, these folks need to be listened to. And I do want Flutter to be great because there will be apps written in it. There will be things I have to use that are built in Flutter. And the better the framework can be, the better software can be. And I will gladly throw my channel at this problem to do everything I can to support these guys. And to really quickly answer, did the changes actually shut people up? Surprisingly so, yes. I am amazed at how much less grifter shill type comments I get now because there is an explicit 1 minute of this part was paid for that is a separate message. And the way I phrase this somewhat sarcastically is you can pay me to be dishonest in 1 minute chunks now. That said, I actually quite like most of the sponsors that we're working with, and I've used almost all of their products now and had a few that really stuck with me that I quite enjoy. So it's still a good way to figure out about new stuff. And all those sponsors are people who watch the channel and get it and are part of this community. So it's not like I'm taking sponsorships from some sketchy pyramid scheme. I'm taking sponsorships from things that are aligned with my audience. Anyways, back to the state of the team and the cultural gap here. There's a number of significant blind spots for the Flutter team, which largely revolve around the fact the members of the team have never been responsible for routinely delivering app features and fixes that are built upon Flutter. Whew! Whew! Now we're cooking with gas. This is a really, really big deal. This is one of the things I think, and I hate to just keep pointing at React, but I think they've done really well with this recently. For a long time, React wasn't used too heavily at Meta. It was used for some ad stuff. It was used for a little bit of Instagram web stuff, but it wasn't used across the whole Facebook code base. I swear, when they hit the on button for the new React Facebook experience, the speed at which things started to change and progress started to happen in the React world was hard to fathom. They dog food React so hard at Meta now. The entire VR platform now, all of the mixed reality and virtual reality Quest stuff, so much of that is built with React Native. And the result is that React Native has leveled up significantly as well. They were able to test all of these crazy new things that they have been shipping recently by running them on massive internal code bases. The entire Quest store, the entire Instagram and Facebook experiences for Quest, half their menu systems in Quest, all built in React Native. They also just built a desktop app for building 3D experiences, which is also in React Native. They are testing and pushing the limits of all of these things. And there's a lot of line blurring between the team building the apps and the team building the frameworks. And I think that's aligned them really well, where generally speaking, devs building applications with React, they might feel like things are changing too fast, but it's rare they say that the React team is fundamentally not understanding the needs of React developers. There was a moment where it felt like that was happening, but the more Meta and the more the React team invested in building apps with the framework, the faster that feeling eroded. And I honestly now feel like the React team understands as well, if not better, what building apps with React looks like than I do externally, which is huge. It makes those conversations really, really good. And it breaks my heart to see the opposite playing out in the Flutter world, where the Flutter team doesn't build Flutter apps because Google doesn't invest much in building applications with Flutter. That's sad. And it hurts me to hear this. In other words, I believe there are blind spots because the Flutter team members don't actually use Flutter. Thank you for putting it so bluntly, so I don't have to. Yeah, it sucks. It really does. Good call out here about the urgency around issues not being appreciated, as well as the expense and time you're spending trying to contribute to this externally. You can't know that as a person who works on it every day and is just part of Google. This is a really good call out, and I sincerely hope everyone on the Flutter team, especially leads on the Flutter team, reads this particular paragraph. This is so important, so well put, and I'm thankful this was written in such a friendly but stern way. Thank you again, Matt, for this super declarative in chat here. If the Flutter team doesn't recognize the contribution problem, and therefore they won't take steps to address it, what else can be done? That's where we find ourselves in this post and in this effort. We've decided that the one thing we can do to help the labor issue is to fork Flutter. I love how this was orchestrated. The describing of the situation, the clearly laying out what options exist and why they aren't working, leading us to what is now a natural conclusion, which is if we want Flutter to win, we have to fork. This isn't we're forking Flutter because we have our own opinions. This isn't we're forking Flutter because there's this one feature we really want. It's we feel like the Flutter team's incentives aren't aligned with us, the community right now. There is no leverage for us to push this the right way. A fork offers real leverage. Introducing Flock. Our fork of Flutter is called Flock. We describe Flock as Flutter Plus. I also love the idea that Flock, because flocks are like groups of birds, this is the community, the wider effort. It's actually a really clever name now that I'm thinking about it. In other words, we do not want or intend to fork the Flutter community. This is a huge call out as well. Their goal is to be as up-to-date as possible and as well aligned with Flutter as possible. And ideally, the things that merge into Flock will get merged downstream into Flutter eventually. And by having this place where the community can confidently merge the changes, hopefully instead of community having bad relationships with Flutter, community can have good relationships with Flock, and eventually Flock and Flutter can build a better relationship. And maybe even long-term, the need for Flock will go away. This almost reminds me of like the IO.js moment in the Node world, where there was a Node fork that tried to fix a lot of the problems in Node, and eventually they all got hired in and Node got fixed. This feels very Node to IO.js here, which is a good thing. That pushed Node really, really far, and it's awesome to see it here. As I said before, Flock will remain constantly up to date with Flutter, and that they'll do important bug fixes as well as popular community features, which the Flutter team either can't or won't implement. By forking Flutter, we get to decide what gets merged. We won't lower the quality bar, but by controlling merge decisions, we do gain the following opportunities. We can recruit a much larger PR review team than the Flutter team, which means you get faster review times. We can recruit PR reviewers who are ready to facilitate contributions instead of merely tolerating them. This means support for a wider contributor audience. They can also optimize policies. Like, they don't have to blindly demand design docs and conference calls when they won't substantially add to the effectiveness of the task at hand. The fact that all of these types of things are necessary is a little absurd. The fact that there are these types of blockers like design docs and conference calls that you have to possibly do just to get a small thing merged is kind of absurd. I've never heard of somebody on the React team requesting a design doc or call to convince them of a fix. That just feels absurd to me, and my heart breaks that people are trying to fix these things and all of these things that make sense internally at Google. Like, if you were an employee on the Flutter team and somebody who manages the team requested that you do these things, it might make some sense, but that's not how you run open source. That's just not how open source works at all. You make a change, either it's good and it gets merged, or it's bad and Linus calls you an incompetent dev in the email chain. That's how open source works. I would also love to see, like, it's an impossible to get number, but like, how many meetings per PR? I bet the ratio there for Flutter is really bad. More points that are important here. They want to make sure that they use the success of contributions to socially promote more contributions. I will do my part here. If I see cool contributions happening in the Flutter world, I will absolutely be smashing that retweet button, even though, again, I'm not a Flutter guy. I just think it's important that devs who care have leverage against the owners who don't. Speaking of which, we're all Flutter users. We should leverage the team and company relationships to identify market priorities. Yes. One way of thinking about all of this work is the leverage that exists around Flutter and decisions in Flutter is currently by a team that doesn't build apps in Flutter and is living the big corporate life in constant fear of getting laid off. But the devs who are using Flutter need this stuff to change and get fixed, but they don't have any leverage against the owners. And what Flock is trying to do is finally give that leverage to the people actually building with Flutter. Awesome. And they're not the only fork, by the way. There have been a few others we'll cover in a little bit. But they're the first one to really, as far as I know, go all in on this community focus. We want to be the place where people can actually get changes shipped to Flutter. As Flock ships important bug fixes and features, the Flutter team can then choose to add those to Flutter on their schedule. The community will no longer be limited by the Flutter team's availability, nor will the community need to beg the Flutter team to please accept a change. The Flutter team can use Flock solutions or not, but all Flock users will have access to them, which will eliminate your company and your team's urgency and desperation. This fork's the coolest and most promising fork I've seen. Unironically, yes. This is what I wanted to see out of like the WordPress stuff. So how can you help if you're aligned with this effort? The first thing they put, and I think it makes a lot of sense, is first, alpha test the fork. Try running the newest version of Flock in your existing Flutter apps. See what works, see what doesn't, report the issues, work with the team, and make sure you can use Flock. And then when new releases come out, if you have the time, run them against your apps and make sure they work as expected. This is a community effort. And if historically you have not been rewarded for doing this with traditional Flutter, reset your mental expectation. Because I know a lot of Flutter devs probably use a new version of Flutter, it doesn't work, and they hesitate to even open the issue at this point because nothing ever happens. Reset your expectations. Do it. Cut the issue now. You might be surprised how quickly they address it now. As they say here, the first step is to mirror Flutter. That means they have to automatically mirror the master, beta, and stable branches, along with replicating the release tags. They also hope that once the framework is mirrored, that they'll be able to automatically build and upload the engine and make those binaries available for Flock users. As we work through the mirroring process, it would be a big help if you want to try building your app with Flock. You shouldn't see any difference between Flock and Flutter, and you can configure Flock with a tiny Flutter version manager configuration. Really good stuff. You can also become a reviewer. I love this call out. This is plug to a sponsor. They may or may not be the sponsor of this video, but I found them genuinely really helpful. CodeRabbit. It is an app you set up that just leaves code reviews on your PRs, and it's free for open source. They're not perfect. They will not catch all the bugs and the nuance of how your code base works. They don't have the context of all the things you know about how it works. But you can think of it almost like a junior engineer leaving an early review on something where they'll catch stuff like typos, syntax mistakes, and it also makes these nice little diagrams showing how the change works. It tries to summarize. It gives you one-click applies for things that are mistakes that an AI could easily catch. It's just an example of something that makes your life as a reviewer easier. Hopefully, we've all had the experience where we were working on a pull request, we were reviewing some code that was complex, but someone else already reviewed it. And now it's easier to go through and focus on the hard parts and ignore all the nitpicky stuff that you would normally look towards for like your first review pass. Stuff like CodeRabbit helps a ton with that first pass. Graphite also has something similar if you're in the graphite world, which is really good. I've heard their reviewers incredible. Haven't had a chance to play with it yet, but I've been surprised with these types of tools. Alongside that, reviewing, even if you're not a lead or that familiar, it's not a bad idea. And this, folks who are helping with Flock, please tell me if I'm overstepping here. Like, please. It is reasonable to ask questions about things you don't understand in pull requests if the team culture is okay with that. I often say this, especially when I'm running teams in enterprises and companies. It's okay to ask a question like, what does this do? Or can you give me some information on why this works this way? Those can be really helpful, both because the thing might be wrong and the reason you're confused might be it's not working as intended, or even better, it is working as intended, but it's hard to understand why. And when you're deep in a code base where you understand how everything works, you lose the context of somebody who doesn't have it. And when you have that incredible value of a person who doesn't know how it works, giving you feedback on why it's hard to understand, that is useful because your brain can't work that way. You can't pull yourself out of the knowing how it works mindset well enough to give a review or try to understand it from the perspective of someone who doesn't know it well. It is awesome to give that feedback as somebody new to a code base because now they're getting a perspective they wouldn't have. Yes, the curse of knowledge. Thank you, chat, I always forget that term. I just went through this with the Laravel community where I ran into some problems with how hard it was for me to set up Laravel because it didn't meet my expectations as a modern full stack JS dev. And rather than say, oh, I'm stupid and wrong, plenty of people did, the team at Laravel took it seriously and made meaningful changes and improvements to the onboarding experience because they know, despite their curse of knowledge, I'm a good enough dev that I shouldn't have problems setting up, and they fixed them. So if you're confused with things you're seeing in the Flutter code base as you're reviewing things, especially if it's like a PR that you feel like you should be able to understand, but there's parts that you don't, ask questions. It can be really helpful because the team can clarify why the thing's confusing, not just for you in that instance in that PR, but maybe they need to leave a comment on top of the thing saying why it works this way or document it better somewhere else. Leave those questions. Don't like spam like 50 questions per PR or anything, but if you're trying to do an honest review and an honest understanding of something, ask the question. But we want reviewers to go even further than that. We don't just want to tolerate contributions, we want to facilitate them. Because one of the best ways to facilitate people contributing is to make the whole repo a welcoming place. If you'll ask questions in a PR, they're much more likely to file one of their own in the future. And if you can give them a good environment to ask those questions and learn these things, they are so much more likely to actually leave a contribution long term. As Matt calls out here, many of us have had the experience of getting a PR 90% to the finish line only to have a Flutter team reviewer declare that it can't merge until we do something that we don't know how to do. It's an awful experience and we aim to avoid it with Flock. Oh, there are so many of these like heartbreaking one-liners in this that I'm at the point where if this goes well, I might become a Flutter fanboy because if this is the stuff that's keeping Flutter from going from good to great, this might be the moment where Flock and Flutter especially goes from like usable to good. This is really cool. I like on one hand, it's heartbreaking to see how much of these things block. But my favorite thing is when a blocker like that goes away, to see the success and growth that comes. Like when the browser got good enough that we could build real apps in it, the web got so much better and the experience that we had in it got so much better. If Flutter loses these blockers, it can improve alarmingly quick as well. We want Flock reviewers who are willing to step in and help a contributor achieve the final 10% of that PR. That doesn't mean contributors get to be lazy, but if a contributor's done everything that he or she knows how to do, and the PR is close to complete, then we want the reviewer to step in and provide direction for the final 10%. This is how we educate contributors and ensure that the next PR is 100% complete. You can even reach out if you want to be a reviewer. Super, drop their Twitter here. By the way, give Super Declarative a follow. I've never seen somebody handle something like this well. This is like, I'm going to reference this in the future if I see other communities that need that level of innovation. This is a model on how to push back on a project that's maintainers aren't handling it properly. This is an incredible reference point for other open source communities to have in the future if they run into these issues. More of their call to actions. This one is really big and important. Become a lead. Maintaining and extending a long-lived fork of Flutter requires some number of experts who direct specific areas of the project. For example, I'm initially stepping up as the director of Flock, as well as the framework lead. Jesse has stepped up as the engine lead. We'd like to bring in a Flutter tool lead who directs extensions to the Flutter CLI tool. We'd also like to break up the engine responsibilities with a lead per platform, Android, iOS, Mac, Windows, and Linux. To be clear, you should know how Flutter internally works pretty well if you want to reach out to possibly be a lead. But this is the biggest thing that is from what I see externally, feels like it's missing is without proper leads and assignments, there's a lack of ownership that results in these things sitting around and not getting merged. It's really good to have this as like one of the first focused missions of the Flock project. How can we get owners for these parts so that one person, one place isn't blocking you somewhere else? Huge, and I really hope they can find those people. Let's shift Flutter into overdrive and help make it the universal UI toolkit it should have been. Flutter has the potential to outshine every alternative in the market, but it needs the community to flock together to help it get there. Let's do this. I'm in. I'm aligned. I want to see this happen. I will say this type of pushback disappoints me a lot. I feel like this is the type of mindset that results in tools failing to grow. I saw this a lot in Angular, where there were people in the Angular community, I'll call it one in particular, Brandon Roberts, who really liked the cool things happening in other places and tried to bring the best parts to Angular. And the amount of pushback they get hurts. It's really sad to see. And if this was just a fork happening because technically speaking they had disagreements, cool, but it isn't that. What's going on here is a community misalignment, and the fork is being used as a lever to push. So I wanted to quickly cover these other forks. Now that I fully understand the context, I don't think they're as relevant, but they're all interesting to call out because they all have reasons for existing. The big one is Shorebird. The guy who made Flutter quit and made Shorebird because one of the big issues that I and others had with Flutter is you had no ability to change what the app did without updating it in the App Store. And code push is essential for most businesses, especially big ones, because you can't wait weeks for the App Store to approve your changes and then wait months, if not years, for all your users to download the latest binary. If you're able to change things that aren't a big deal, that aren't new feature adds without the App Store blocking you, you often end up with horrible versions where people are using versions of your app from months ago and you're getting bug reports from things that you fixed a year ago because somebody's using an old version of your app. Code push is the actual only way to meaningfully prevent that. And Flutter couldn't do it. React Native very easily could. Flutter can't. Shorebird is a fork with the goal of making it so they can. It's also a company and a product. And if you're using Flutter, I'd be surprised if you haven't at least investigated this because code push is so helpful. And it says a lot that one of the original creators forked in order to get these features added. Apparently, you can't self-host using Shorebird, though. So even though it is open source and it's a fork, you can't self-host the bundles that are the things you're code pushing. So there's an operating system named Aurora that also has a fork that they're maintaining in Russian, which is interesting. There's a fork that's Flutter for Apple TV. Not sure how well maintained it is, but they did that because new platform support is really hard to get merged in main. And as I mentioned before, Flutter's architecture and the way the engine works kind of commands that the platforms are part of Flutter itself. Unlike with React Native, where people are like third-party building their own React Native bindings for Vision Pro or for random other devices like PlayStation and Xbox, both use React Native heavily, and they're running it on their own bindings because the separation at an architectural level allows them to do that without it being part of Flutter. Where with even supporting Apple TV, a fork almost feels necessary to get that working how they expect. I think those were the key ones. I just wanted really to call out the Shorebird thing because there is a precedent of forks happening, and I can see why people in the Flutter community would be hesitant about a new fork simply because their experience is these forks are attempts to add one specific feature that don't get maintained and end up dying. But the goal here isn't that. The goal here isn't to just add a few features the Flutter team is blocking. I even asked, what are the issues that push you over the edge here? And they did a great job of telling me, there is no one issue. We can give examples, but the issue here is the relationship and the lack of good incentives. And I totally see that here. My last word on this, my personal happy path that I see here is that Flock succeeds. And I don't mean that Flock becomes the thing everyone builds their app in and Flutter just gets deprecated and dies. I mean that Flock gets enough traction, investment, contribution, and success that it would be irresponsible for the Flutter team to not acknowledge it and meaningfully collaborate. My ideal ending here isn't Flock kills Flutter. My ideal ending here is Flutter effectively gets to kill Flock. Because if the Flutter team can see what's going on there, can learn the lessons that they will learn, take those contributors, take the contributions, and maybe even hire the people who stick out as leads, and take the opportunity that Flock has so generously given them to make a better community and a better Flutter, that would be success here. And I do sincerely hope the Flutter team takes the opportunity and acknowledges the fact that someone like me who doesn't care can even see clearly why this effort happens. If you're working on Flutter at Google, take some time to reflect on this. I know you get it. there are people there who get it. If you're watching this, you're probably one of them. Fight, spectate, be involved, and make sure the people who care about Flutter don't get left behind. That's all I have to say on this one. Until next time, peace, nerds.